Mr. Jacques and your team, thank you for showing up. Appreciate your work. I would say, with it being well over a year since we've had a budget, it's nice to have some picture as parliamentarians for, as you say, setting the table for what's to come. I hope I want to make sure I understand some of the assumptions that you've made, just so that I understand your very sobering testimony, and I thank you for, mentioning kind of how serious of a moment we're in fiscally. If I look at Appendix A in your detailed economic outlook, you're not forecasting a recession, is that correct? Like you have unemployment, it's up in 2025, but it's back down afterwards in 26 onwards, and you have real GDP growth. It's small, but it's positive 1.2, 1.3 ongoing. So you're not projecting a recession, is that correct?
No,
okay.
We're not projecting a recession, just very moderate growth.
So our current debt service costs, or even just the amount of debt we're taking on each year, is increasing at an alarming rate without any economic recession or headwinds. Not to say we don't have economic challenges, but my point is your assumptions are that the economy actually is growing from here on out, that unemployment is falling, and we're still seeing some fairly serious increases in annual debt service costs, and substantially, as my colleague has just pointed out, up to about $80 billion a year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. So, and I'm not challenging your assumptions, but obviously there are other pathways the economy can take. Some people are saying, well, unemployment actually may continue to increase. Growth might actually be a lot slower than we project. If unemployment goes up further or growth is not as high as you project, what will happen to the deficit and then the subsequent debt service costs?
If the economic path is worse than projected or worse than we anticipate, then the deficit figures will deteriorate.
Right.
I would, and something I think I mentioned to the committee last week, I would say on our end we're feeling pretty good about where things stand in the short term. So where we are now and going out over the next 12 to 18 months. The big question, and it's a policy question, which isn't in our bailiwick, but certainly is in the bailiwick of parliamentarians, is where do we end up in years 3, 4, and 5? Given the rupture that the Prime Minister has referred to, given the Prime Minister's reference to, quote, there's no going back, how do we get to those areas of growth? What are the policies that are going to be in place to ensure that the Canadian economy can return to its full potential growth?
Right. Yeah. I guess what I'm highlighting, or what I'm glad you're kind of confirming, is we might not be in the worst economic environment yet. And what we're seeing actually with the levels of spending is we're increasing the risk to the fiscal framework of the country before we're in potentially much more serious economic challenges. Like if we're going to spend almost 14 cents of every dollar on interest on the debt without a recession in the next couple of years, what could that be if there is a recession? Could be 15, could be 18, could be, any number. Would you view that as a risk to the framework?
I would view it as, and going back to quote, no one ever got laughed out of the room by quoting the Governor of the Bank of Canada. It's positive growth, but it's not going to feel good for most Canadians across the country. And in a situation, it definitely gives one pause where the economic numbers are positive and the fiscal numbers are negative and substantially negative.
And we're borrowing record amounts of debt in the markets today, correct?
That's our time, I'm
Pardon
sorry.
me, pardon me, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Gasparo.
I just wanted to pick up where we left off when the chair so abruptly cut me off last time. We're issuing a record amount of debt this year, as I understand. The last debt management strategy came out early in the summer. I think about 620 odd billion dollars has to be issued this year. Is that your understanding as well? Okay. If the government is saying we will spend less and invest more, in theory, these investments will have a return, of course, because investments do have returns. But they continue to borrow short-term debt instruments. How does that, usually you try to match your assets and liabilities, but if you continue to borrow on the short end of the curve, as they say, but making long-term investments, does that not increase the risk to taxpayers that as interest rates change, taxpayers are, and the government's far more exposed to these sensitivity in interest rates such that, our debt service costs could actually increase much more quickly if rates were to go up for any reason? I'll note the rates were dropped recently, but the 5-year yield actually increased after the Bank of Canada increased its rates. Is that your understanding as well? We should be looking at the matching of assets and liabilities?
I think duration matching is a pretty fundamental principle of borrowing and investment to make sure that you're not exposed to fluctuations in the financial market, and you need to come up with cash when in fact you can't because the money's tied up in longer term assets.
Right. Or it's an admission that actually what you're doing is just borrowing to do the operations of government. You don't have to answer that. I'll just leave that there. I read a report earlier this year from the IMF that referenced for every dollar that was spent on interest on the debt, there was a somewhat reduction in spending on social services. Are you aware of that report that came out in the spring, I think? Is that a report that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I'm the report. Actually, I think I read the report. I forget it was several months ago, and I read a lot. I forget the precise numbers, but I am familiar with it. But the underlying principle associated with a lot of the basic macroeconomic models is a dollar that the higher your debt and the greater your debt interest costs, it ends up eating up spending in other areas, whether it be social programming or investment or so what have you.
Right. So when you say, when you use the word unsustainable, is that also what you're getting at? That the level of debt that we have and the burden of the service costs of that debt is unsustainable such that a consequence would be a reduction in social service spending?
A reduction in spending. Again, we don't do policy.
Sure.
We do budgeting, and from a basic budgeting perspective, you have spending and you got revenues, and in a situation where you have a large deficit, and effectively it's not, your debt levels are growing at an unsustainable rate, you got to either increase your revenues or you got to decrease your spending.
Right. And so when there were questions asked about increasing debt and deficits 5 and 6 years ago, or saying, after the new administration took over and said they were running some small deficits, debt service costs were about, I think, 7 or 8 cents on the dollar. You're now projecting that goes to 14 cents on the dollar. Some people were laughed out of the room for asking questions about why we should be concerned about this, but here we are. And again, that's before we have any serious economic downturns or even a recession. So would you say that spending is at risk as debt service costs continue to increase? Is that a fair?
That would be conventional macroeconomic policy as practiced by the world.
So are we close to where we were in the mid-90s? Maybe are we closer to where we were in the mid-90s than we were 10 years ago?
the numbers in the mid-90s were far more alarming. This is with an increase, now with the federal debt to GDP ratio forecast to increase. If we don't change things, we're going to end up there again.
Thank you
Thankfully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Ruffsworth, please, for